Welcome. I'm so glad you could come this afternoon. Come on in the parlor and sit down. Here we are. This is a presentation for Beyond All Limits Virtual Doll Convention. This particular program is Hold On Tightly to Your Dreams, a tale of Izannah Walker and her dolls. My name is Paula Walton. If you don't know me, I am a doll maker, and I make reproduction Izannah Walker dolls, and I also do restoration work on antique Izannah Walkers. I do some other doll making, and I'm a dressmaker. I do a lot of other 18th and 19th century women's handiwork. So that's a little bit about who I am. And so we're going to sit here and we're going to have a nice visit, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about Izannah Walker, her life, and her the dolls, the wonderful, amazing, iconic dolls that she made. So I think to start, I'd like to tell you a little bit about where we are. We're sitting in the parlor of my 1791 house, and we're in Connecticut. Izannah Walker spent most of her life in either Somerset, Massachusetts, or then Central Falls, Rhode Island. She was born in 1817 on September 25th, and she was the third and youngest surviving child of Gilbert Walker and his third wife, Sarah Swazi. She had 6 older half-siblings from her dad's marriage to his second wife, and then she had 2 older sisters, and then later her mother unfortunately died giving birth to a son, a younger child, and so the baby also died, and then her dad died right after that. So in 1824, Izannah and her 3 sisters went to stay with her maternal grandparents and aunt and uncle. And they went to the family homestead, which in 1824 was almost a century old at that time. So it would have been an early 18th century home. So if in 1824 it was almost a century old, so let's say it's probably 1730s to 1740s home, which is a little older than this house here. But the thing about this room is, when Izannah was born, this house was already 16 years old. So this would be the kind of room that she would be familiar with in her lifetime. So that kind of sets the scene. And she would have been living her young life about 160 miles from here, which now is a couple of hours. Then it was a much longer journey. And for the most part, we're going to skip ahead here a little bit. These are my notes. I'm trying to stay a little bit more organized for this particular presentation. I have a tendency to skip around quite a bit. So by 1845, Izannah Walker, we were pretty sure, was already making dolls. There was her great niece said later on in her life that her great aunt started making dolls as early as 1845. So she started making the dolls in Somerset, Massachusetts, but then between 1850 and 1853, she leaves Somerset Village, Massachusetts, and moves to Central Falls, Rhode Island, which that's slightly closer to here, about 148 miles. So now geographically, you kind of know where she was at. The next significant thing in her life was in 1855, one of her dolls was purchased for Martha Chase. And the reason that's significant is because Martha Chase later became a very well-known doll maker in her own right. And she is said to have been inspired in the dolls she made by the Izannah Walker doll she had as a child. Okay, so that catches us up a little bit until 1865, when that was a census year. And the Rhode Island State Census lists Izannah Walker's occupation as a doll maker. Coincidentally, the Massachusetts State Census from that year shows Jane Walker, and Jane, hence that would be Izannah's sister and her aunt, as doll manufacturers. So that sort of leaves us with a question. Did they all make dolls separately, or had they been working together before, and then Izannah moved and they continued to make dolls in two different places? That's why I kind of feel that this tale of Izannah Walker is a little bit of a mystery. I don't think it was probably super mysterious in her lifetime, but because those little bits of everyday life that you know about yourself, you don't always write all those things down. And it's a mystery to us because we don't know the answers to these, but I'm sure that she wasn't really a mysterious woman when she was alive. It's just now we don't really have any records of, you know, exactly how that worked. But we do know that all three women were doll makers. So that catches us up to, you know, having everybody as a doll maker. And now I'd like to talk about the dolls. I'm mostly interested in pre-patent Izannah Walker dolls, and those would be all the ones manufactured and made before she received her U.S. patent. She was the first woman to receive a United States patent for doll making, which is pretty amazing and wonderful. What I have here for you is these 11 dolls. 10 of them are dolls from my collection, and one of them is a visitor. This doll is Prudence, and she actually belongs to a very dear friend of mine. She was in the 2017 special exhibit that I curated for the Jenny Lind Doll Show. So Prudence is making a special appearance here today, and I just really want to say thank you. So if you guys didn't get to see the Jenny Lind exhibit, you're getting to see a good portion of it here. We did have over 20 dolls there at the exhibit, and it was wonderful. A lot of us got together, and I have to say thank you to the people that traveled partway across the country and were very generous to share their dolls with everyone so that they could see such a huge grouping of Izannah Walker dolls. It was really spectacular. So the first doll I really want to talk about here, this is the oldest doll that I own. Her name is Eliza Jane. And Eliza Jane is one of the earliest of Izannah's dolls. I kind of roughly break them into groups. It's hard to give exact dates, but this doll would be, the best I can guess, between 1845 and ending sometime before 1855. And these very early dolls have a more square face. They also have flatter eyes. They're not as rounded. Their lips are rather flat, and their nose is not as pronounced. They have lovely painting in the fine lines around their eyes, and that's usually a dark brown. The curls on their painted hair are a little more folk arty. They're not as polished as and professional looking as the curls in the later dolls, although I truly love this style. This is like, it's one of my favorites. The other thing about these dolls is they have extremely long arms and somewhat larger hands and larger feet. The bodies, the waists are a little wider, the hips are wider, and usually the second skin body covering on these dolls will be either a natural off-white or a pale pink linen cambric. So that's some of the marks of that earliest style of doll. Eliza Jane is the only example I have here today, although I have been fortunate enough to see others. So right after that time period, the dolls sort of started to change a little bit, and I'm going to give you my best guess as to which of these dolls would have come next. I've got 3 dolls in particular that have rather square faces. This is Izannah, and she's, if you see, that face is still rather square. Now, there is more definition in her lips, and her eyes are not as flat. And the arms have gotten much shorter. Next is Hannah, and I'm going to lift Hannah up because we've got quite a bit of light here. So I'm going to get her over here. Okay, Hannah also, if you see her face shape up next to Eliza Jane, there's a lot of similarity there. Hannah's eyes are more rounded, and her nose is better, is not quite as flat, and her lips have more curvature. But that face shape is still very similar. It's not quite as square as Eliza Jane's, but it's definitely along that look. And then the third doll is Isabelle, and she also has a somewhat square face, but it is getting rounder. Her eyes are not super rounded, and her lips are quite nicely curved, but her nose is still a little flat, and I don't think that that's all just from wear. So those would be the next group of dolls that that I think came after that very early group, and this would be 1855 to 1861. Then, still within that time period, I think these 3 dolls are closer to the 1855 date. Then these 2, Ismay and Prudence, if you'll notice, they've suddenly gotten much rounder. The eyes are very round, the necks are quite narrow. They have, their noses are quite worn, but they would have originally been much rounder, and their lips. So these dolls, I think, are closer to 1861, but not quite there yet. One thing I do want to call your attention to on Prudence is most of the boots are black. Izannah did bare feet and painted boots. These are actually dark green, and I'm just sure that that was the original paint color. It's just amazing. I've never really seen dark green ones before. Occasionally you will find a blue, but this dark green is something new for me, and I think it's truly spectacular. So then our next group of dolls, when we get into past 1861 and up till 1873, this last group of pre-patent dolls, and all of these dolls, if I haven't said it, are pre-patent. I'm really, that's what my focus is. But this last group of dolls are what I think of as the truly iconic image of an Izannah Walker doll that a lot of people think of when they think of her dolls. So this one is Tilly Lamb, and she was in the Your Dolls and Mine from the 1950s, that book. And Tilly Lamb is a 20-inch doll, and she's just enough different that I feel that she's the next step, that she's very closely related to both this doll and this doll. But I think she's just, you know, a smidge onward. It's kind of hard to define these things because as a doll maker, those of you that make dolls, you know, they change, and no two are exactly alike. But so that's Tilly Lamb. This is Isabeau. Isabeau is a lovely doll. Obviously she's got quite a bit of wear and her paint has cracked, but she has the rounded eyes and the nice rounded nose. And if you look at the paint on her curls, you can see that that is much different, a much more polished look than Eliza Jane's. Now, this is a brand new doll. I know I should have named her for today, but I just haven't come up with the exact right name for her yet. So the as yet unnamed doll. She has one of the other hairstyles that Izannah painted with the little short wisps around the face. And all of these hairstyles, both the short wisps and the ringlet curls, these are children's hairstyles, and you will see that in both early photographs and in painted portraits. This is what little children, this is how their hair was at that time. And so this particular doll has bare feet, and she's got these lovely hands. The arms are a little shorter than Eliza Jane's, and even a little bit shorter than Ismay's, but still lovely, beautiful dolls with wonderful fingers and quite expressive hands. Next to her is my smallest, which is Izzy Bell. Izzy Bell is about 14 inches, and clearly Izzy Bell has had a very adventuresome, hard life. She's quite worn and ragged, but dearly loved. And then this doll, if I can reach back here and get her to show you, this is Charlesy, and she's a wonderful doll, and she should be much taller than this. She should be about 23 inches, but the only original part left on her is her head, and she was later, somebody put her on this funky little weird body. But she's got that just truly lovely rounded Izannah look that you're going to find in those later pre-patent dolls. And I think she's a very sweet girl. So that kind of gives you guys a tour of these dolls and some idea of how I very roughly date them. And of course, that could change as more research is done and more, you know, if somebody gets more information, that would be awesome. But this is sort of my dating system. And if you've read my magazine articles for Anti-Doll Collector, then you know that I based a lot of this on photographs and was able to tell by both photographic evidence and or certain dolls that have a very long provenance, and you know exactly who owned them. And that's kind of how I came up with these divisions. I spoke for just a moment about the hairstyles and those all being children, and the clothing is too. So they were originally all dressed as children, and sometimes you see them redressed and you see them in adult styles, but she meant them to be children and made them for children to play with. I mean, now we collect them, but they were always a child's toy. So I think it would be a really great time to talk about clothes for a few minutes. I guess I'll start out with what I'm wearing. And this is a Civil War era 1860s-ish dress. It's lavender and sort of a silver silk taffeta. Normally it would be worn over a caged crinoline, and I am not wearing it over one today because this is a very small room and I've added lots of extra stuff in here. And so if I had the caged crinoline under here, it would be taking up all the room and I would be bumping into things, and I really just didn't want to knock the dolls over, so I'm going without. And I have a tendency to dress a little bit eccentrically anyway, so I figure if I was dressing in the 1860s, I would probably have been somewhat eccentric then too. And I have on a Sontag, which is this little tied shawl. You may have seen those featured in the latest Little Women movie. But the dolls, a lot of them have those on today too. It was very chilly in here. It's early spring in New England, and it was only 28 degrees when I got up this morning. The parlor was quite cold, and my furnace quit working. So we've all bundled up. For those of you who are interested, I don't knit. Yarn and I, that's not a thing. I do fabric and cloth, but not yarn. So this cape, little shawl cape, was actually a wonderful hand-knitted gift from a very sweet customer who made that for me, and it's exquisite. These other little Sontags that the girls are wearing are actually made by American girls. They're retired and they were from the 90s, but you can still find them, and obviously quite easily because I found a lot of them. So we're making do with, unfortunately, with purchased Sontags, although they did say they were hand knit. So the other name for them is bosom friend, and sometimes you'll hear them called that. So I want to show you guys, I pulled out a bunch of clothing, since VDC people are very interested in clothing usually. Really, most of the examples that I have on the dolls are short sleeved, and a lot of them you will see in various forms of short sleeves, but they could also have worn long sleeve dresses. This one is a gorgeous sort of lavender purple print. It's got cartridge pleating. This would not have been from an Izannah Walker doll. I'd probably fit on a china or a paper mache, but stylistically, age-wise, fabric-wise, it is a perfect dress style for them, and they certainly could have worn something like that. Next, I'd like to talk to you about, since we're on doll clothes, about what the Izannahs wear under these clothes. They usually always come with a chemise. This one would be about knee length, and it's kind of a plain one. And sometimes they're only like hip length, so they come in different lengths, but they should have a chemise. And they should have drawers or pantalettes. Most of them actually, this pair isn't, but most of them are actually split drawers where that seam would be open and they would only be connected at the waist. And then they would have at least one petticoat, sometimes more. So that would be what you would expect to have under their clothing. Now, this is a child size chemise, and it's kind of a little bit easier to see. It does have these lovely underarm gussets, and I'm kind of a gusset girl. I do like gussets, but most of the time the doll size ones do not have those gussets. And this would fit a toddler. I've had it on my granddaughter and it was lovely. We'll go back to sweet Eliza Jane here, and she actually has just her underwear on so that she can model for you guys. And she's got this really fantastic chemise on, and it's a long one, but it's got this lovely wide band at the top, And then she's got on this petticoat, and the petticoat does have a growth tuck, and it's just very plainly trimmed, and it's nice gathers. So that's what you expect underneath their clothing. Then let's go through a little bit of children's clothing from that time. This would be an infant gown. Mid-19th century infant's clothing. And this is the front. Sometimes people get a little confused about what's the front of the back. This is the back with all these lovely gathers, and they fit and everything. But this slit goes down the back, and the front would have been straight. And you would have had all the interesting parts on the back. And these drawstrings, this draws up so you can adjust the fit. You can do it tighter or looser as you needed for your baby while it grew. But this is clearly infant's clothing because it's sort of extended way past the baby's feet. But so that's what you would have seen on an infant. This, if you will notice the similarity to the Izannah's clothes, this is would fit about a 7 or 8 year old girl. It's a dimity cotton dress. It's a printed dimity. So it's a very, very lovely example of just an everyday girl's dress. Very well made for all that it's just an everyday piece of clothing. All 19th century clothing is pretty amazing. This is one of the reproduction pieces that I have made. It's a girl's dress, and if you'll see, it's got a lot of black velvet trim. A lot of times you'll see black velvet or black braid used for a lot of the trim work on little dresses. Now, these are two dresses that are the same dress. This one is the original, and this is my reproduction of it. Whoops, the silk is so slippery, everything kind of just slides right off. But the interesting thing about these dresses, these are just pieces of fabric. This was cut from a striped fabric, and then the edges were turned under, and it was sewn on and used as trim. Very economical, very effective. And you didn't have to go buy ribbon or fancy braid or anything. You just used the decorative elements on the printed fabric to good effect. This little dress, I think, may have been a boy's dress, and it also has that same kind of fabric trim work. If you'd like to see what it would look like, these are not really dolls, they're child baby-sized mannequins, and so this is the reproduction of the same dress on a baby-sized mannequin, which I'd say probably that would be like a 6-month, 8-month-old baby. The mannequin next to him is wearing a little bit later dress. That would be heading towards the 1870s, but still with the drawstring around the top. So still some elements of the 1860s. And here's our last little examples here. This is a boy's dress. Often you would see red and black plaid in boys' clothing, and this does have black trim. Next to him is one of my reproduction Izannah Walker dolls, done in the black and red as a boy, so you can kind of get some idea of how that looks. The blue dress and the blue print dress in the center, I believe, is also boys' clothing. This little dress is a reproduction that I did of a late 1830s dress. So this would have been going right into the time period where Izannah started making dolls in 1845. This is slightly earlier than this, but so that's how the styles were changing in. And this is a rubber doll, mid-19th century, so, you know, same time period as Izannah. Hi, this is part 2 of my Izannah Walker video through the wonderfulness of hopefully video editing. We're going to get these 2 parts together. We had to stop last night. Apparently I can only record 30 minutes of video at a time, and also it was getting really dark, and so it was getting too dark to see the dolls in here. So let's just take up where we left off. I was talking about this doll, in this rubber doll she has leather arms and leather body, and she's in a pink wool dress. And I was saying that the dress is stylistically like the Izannah Walker doll clothing, and this whole doll is from that same mid 19th century time period. Another dress I'd really like to show you is the one over here on this big china doll. This is a child's dress because this is quite a large doll, but if you can see this fabric, this is a wonderful kind of orangey yellow fabric that was known as cheddar, and that was a very, very popular color then. So you've got these little fluttery sleeves, and they have a little tuck in them, and the off the shoulder neckline. This one's flat, it's not gathered, but then you've got gathers here and gathering at the waist. So that's just another example of the kind of clothing that would be appropriate for Izannah Walker dolls, and was indeed the kind of clothing that children wore during the mid 19th century. I've got a couple other little pieces here. Both of these are actually reproduction dresses, and we talked about these yesterday about, oh, maybe I didn't. Maybe it was a different take of the video. But these are reproduction dresses, and they are made out of striped fabrics. And what I'd like to mention about those is when you're cutting out these dresses, you can cut on either the lengthwise grain or the crosswise grain. And so depending on which way your stripes run, you would cut in that direction. But the interesting thing about these dresses is, if you'll notice, the stripes are running lengthwise here, but when you cut the waistband, you run the stripes on the waistband this way across the waist, and just the pattern of the fabric creates a contrast and an interesting design element. This is more of the little contrasting striped fabric that's been cut and the edges turned under and used as trim on this dress. This dress here, it doesn't have contrasting fabric. This is all from the same fabric the dress is made out of, but when you change the direction of the stripes and cut them very neatly so that your design of the stripes provides interest in the trimming of the bands, it makes a really nice, well, it's a decorative element on these dresses without actually having to have purchased ribbon or braid or lace. It's just the fabric acting as the trim itself. And of course, here's the doll size version of this same dress. So you can see it's both large and small. Now, I did mention that these are little boys' dresses, and this is a little boy doll dressed in a dress. He's got panelettes under their breeches, but this is an example of a pair of little boys' linen pants that they button on to, well, like they kind of call them blouses, but we would think of it as a shirt. And these would be later. So for really the time period of Izannah Walker's dolls, you would expect the boys to be in dresses. I know a lot of them have been redressed later, and people put them in pants, which is charming and lovely, but really very small boys at that time were wearing dresses. So that kind of ends my show and tell on clothing. I'd like to just move on now and touch on shoes for just a minute. I did mention earlier that the dolls were made with bare feet and painted boots. And So let's just talk about boots and shoes for a second. These particular feet on Tilly Lamb are about the best preserved feet I've ever seen on an Izannah Walker doll. I think the reason for that is that in the early photographs of this doll, she's always shown wearing socks and shoes over these feet, and so I think that they just got protected because, you know, whoever owned her at the time didn't want the painted boots, and so they covered them up. And actually, it's turned out to be a wonderful thing. Now, those boots are like these little versions of children's boots here. This is a brown pair. I actually have a single black one that's very like this, but it's out in the painting studio right now, and I forgot to bring that in to show you guys. But here's the idea. That's these same little boots, and you'll see these laces. There's no tongue. There's just the laces and the skin. And see how this is? It's the same as the way that the shoes are constructed. So that's very much just the style of children's footwear at the time. Now, in some of Izannah's dolls, you will notice that they have the little scallops and the buttons, and that's very faint on some of them. So she did update the footwear as styles changed a little bit. And I'm sure she would have updated the clothing slightly. Now, little boys you would expect to see in tall black boots with a red top. I don't personally own an example of that kind of little boy's footwear, but it was very common, and it's very attractive, and that is what you will find most of her boy dolls painted as, with the black boots and the red tops on them in the front. Now, so now that we've had a chance to meet the dolls and look at all the clothes and talk a little bit about them, I think we should finish off the story of Izannah Walker. So when we last left Izannah and Jane and Aunt Jane, they were doll makers. And to continue their story, there is a lovely record in the 1860s about Jane being a doll maker. And there is a quote from a meeting of the Somerset Historical Society, and Flora Wood presented a paper about her mother, Augusta Lewis Marble, who was born in Somerset in 1861. And the important part here, the part that we are interested in, is the quote that is, "When my mother was a little girl in the 1860s, many of the little girls in Somerset had a Jane Walker doll. I have a picture of my mother holding one. They were handsome and lifelike and made by Miss Jane Walker, who lived on Main Street in the village. They were made in several sizes and sold for up to $10. So that's definitely showing that Jane was actively being a doll maker, and it would have been at a time when Izannah had already moved to Central Falls. So that's extremely interesting. At this point, I don't think we have any way to tell which dolls would have been made by Izannah and which would have been made by Jane and her Aunt Jane. That's one of those other little bits of mystery in this story. But maybe at some point somebody will figure that out. And again, I don't know if they work together or work separately. I mean, I suppose it would be possible that Somerset and Central Falls were not that far apart. Perhaps, you know, they did parts of one doll, you know, in one place, and then they were sent to the other place to be finished and sold, or perhaps they work separately. It's really hard to say, but I would like to talk a little bit now about the price. So the dolls were made in several sizes and sold for up to $10. I figured out in 2017, when I wrote the article for Antique Doll Collector, that due to the rate of inflation, if the US dollar experienced a rate of inflation of 2.12% per year between 1861 and 2017, $10 in the year 1861 is worth $264.18 in 2017. Now, obviously, antique Izannah walkers sell for much, much more than that. But if you stop and think about this, a $264 doll for a child to play with now would be quite extravagant. I mean, that's even higher than American Girl's dolls, even the ones that you design yourself. And I know that because I did one of those for my granddaughter, and it was not quite that high. So the dolls have always been expensive, but well made and lovely and really well loved. The dolls that were being imported from Europe and made in other places, manufactured in larger quantities in other places in the United States, sold for much less than that. Another little story about when the ladies were making dolls in Somerset Village, and I don't know this time exactly if it was before Izannah moved or not, but there is this story about the dolls being hung out on the clothesline and the smell of paint permeating the neighborhood. They get the dolls made and they get them painted, and then they hang them outdoors to dry, and there was a reminiscence of people that lived there smelling that paint smell. So that tells us a little bit more about Jane. Now, big things are coming up for Izannah. In 1873, on June 12th, she applies for a United States patent for an invention related to the manufacture of dolls. And it consists mainly of the secondary or double stuffing next to the external or painted layer, whereby with a sufficiently soft surface the tendency of the paint to crack or scale off is alleviated. And her paint is granted on November 4th, 1873. Now, you know, you will notice that cracking and the scaling off of the paint, that was a problem. That happens, and that did happen in her dolls. That doesn't bother me. I mean, I actually kind of find it endearing, and I love it. But the patent was directly related to that tendency of the paint to crack and scale off. It wasn't for the whole rest of the manufacturing process. It was for the double stuffing next to the external or painted layer. So it's talking about how the inside of the head is stuffed. Now, these heads were made in two-part molds, and I think it would be a good time to talk about the molds. In Izannah's patent, it shows a press that has a mold and a die and a turn that you could press that in and press the cloth into the mold. And the heads are made in two parts, a front and a back, and they're joined together. And you don't really see it a whole lot on most dolls, but you can see there is a seam line there, and it goes over the top of the head. This one is pretty well hidden, but it's there. You can feel it. It's right here, and then the ears are applied over the top of that. So that seam line runs there. Some of them it's a little more prominent than others, but that's the way the heads are made. The cloth is actually pressed into a mold with the stuffing, and it's layered with stuffing and glue and things like that. So another one of the little mysteries about Izannah is, where the heck did the molds come from? And who made the positives that, you know, that the molds were made of? At that time, that would have been called a pattern. So the positive images for the dolls, in Izannah's patent information, she states, in the construction of my doll, I usually employ a press. That was like the little number to the illustration, of ordinary construction, provided with an upper and lower dies of suitable shape to form the front and back of the face, neck, and chest, and sometimes the body of the doll. Although, honestly, I guess I have never really seen one that it pressed the body. Even in the post-patent ones that have the shoulders and like a shoulder plate included in the head, so it's all made in one. The body isn't pressed. I'm not sure if she just didn't put that into action, but she got it in the patent, but then didn't ever implement that. In order to create a sand cast mold for the metal, and the metal was probably cast iron dies, it would have been necessary to compact sand around a model or a pattern. A pattern is a replica of the object to be cast. It can be made of wood, metal, or other materials. So someone had to carve or sculpt this pattern. And it's unclear who did that. It's unclear if Izannah did that herself or if she had somebody else do that for her, and maybe to her specifications. And obviously these dolls, while they're similar, they were made in different molds. So she would have had a lot of molds. I personally do not think that she did commissioned portrait type dolls, only because the cost and the trouble of making a new mold would have been so extraordinary. I mean, she might possibly have painted a doll to look like a child or look in a certain way, done a certain hairstyle or something, but I doubt myself that she had new molds created to do portrait type dolls. It would have been a big undertaking, and it would have been quite expensive, and it would have cut into her profit margin. So I think she didn't do that. And another thing about the dolls, she used a very limited color palette. The dolls really, for the most part, all have brown eyes. You see a rare one or two with blue eyes, and I really haven't gotten to examine those enough to know if it's been overpainted or not. Izannah does actually have blue eyes, but that is overpainting. Somebody changed those to blue, probably because when they decided to freshen up the doll, their child had blue eyes, and so they made the doll have blue eyes too. The hair is all brown. There's different shades of brown, but I tend to think that is because of the earth pigments that would be used. The paints were hand mixed, and although at that time you could get artist oils that were mixed for you, but there would still be hand mixed and made of earth pigments, and it could be possible that just a different batch of the pigments, even though it was basically the same color, like raw umber is actually the color, but it would be slightly different from batch of paint to batch of paint. Now, so that's just a little background on my personal opinion about the molds and whether she did custom molds. But I'd like to introduce you to another person in Izannah's life, Reuben Harlow Neal Bates. And this man was born in Attleboro, Massachusetts in 1802, and he's known to have made dolls similar to those of Izannah Walker's. It's believed that his dolls were never offered for sale, but at least one example of his doll, along with the cast iron mold for its head and the sewing pattern for the doll's body, were passed down through his family. He was a pattern maker all of his working life. If you'll remember, that pattern maker, that's the person that makes the positive image to do the sand casting to make the molds. And he worked in Providence, Rhode Island, and he's listed in the census for 1850, 1860, 1870, and 1880. And a photograph of the Bates doll and accompanying molds appear on page 39 of Janet Joel's 1952 book, Your Dolls and Mine. Those molds are actually supposedly in the collection of the Rhode Island Historical Society, but apparently they've been misplaced in storage, and so they aren't available for view at this time, and you can't get images. And hopefully the storage situation will be rectified at some point, and somebody will remember where someone else years and years ago tucked those molds, because that would be very, very, very interesting. The body of the doll was described as being well made and covered with blue cloth. And actually, the picture in the Janet Joel book looks similar to Izannah. I often stare at that photograph and stare at her, and I think, there's a lot of similarities there. So that's kind of interesting. When the Rhode Island Historical Society actually got those molds, the Reuben Bates molds, they originally thought that they were made by Izannah Walker. And Reuben Bates is known to have been a longtime friend of Izannah's, and he was a pattern maker for the Barstow Stove Company. So that's another of those little things that you gotta just stop and wonder about when you're thinking about Izannah and her dolls and how they came about. So there's all these little pieces that hopefully someday someone will be able to investigate and join together, so that we have a little bit clearer story about how the dolls became to be made. But another little thing I just wanted to mention, we have talked about Eliza Jane, and then how the dolls changed. Okay, just purely speculation here, ladies and gentlemen, but Izannah Walker moved from Somerset Village to Central Falls, and that's kind of around the time that the dolls changed. She moved, we don't have an exact date of when she moved. Remember, that was between 1850 and 1853. But what if Izannah had met Reuben Bates after she moved to Rhode Island, and he began collaborating with her and making the patterns for her dolls, and it would kind of explain the rather dramatic change between the styles of the dolls, the older style and the newer style. And something I didn't really mention when we talked about Eliza Jane before, I did talk about her proportions and how she's a little wider and the arms are longer, the legs and hands are bigger. But when she stands up, she is really in the 18 to 19 inch range like most of these dolls, and that is the most popular size. She looks a lot bigger sitting there, but she's like the same size. The proportions are just so much different, and that's another one of those just really interesting little things. And you can see the side seam on her pretty well. You can just see the stitching line right there. Her ear is missing. It unfortunately got torn off at some point in her life, poor sweetie. But you can just very much see that seam line for the two parts of the mold, which is super interesting. So now we have pretty much covered the possibility of molds, and there's just a few more little mentions in Izannah's story. She has her patent in 1873, and she continues making dolls. And so all those post-patent dolls are made with the included shoulder plate. And then she dies on February 15th, 1888, of consumption, which we would now call pulmonary tuberculosis. And she's buried alongside her best friend, Emmeline Whipple, in the Swan Point Cemetery in Providence, Rhode Island. So you could actually go see her gravesite. Jane lived on until 1899. On October 6th of that year, she died. And when she died, she purchased her own burial plot, and there's a four-sided monument on Jane's grave that includes the birth and death dates of her grandparents and her aunts and her uncle by marriage and her parents, and of her siblings, just 2 of her siblings, the baby brother, Anthony Hines Walker, who only lived to be 11 days. That's the baby that died when Izannah's mother died. And also Izannah Frankfurt Walker. So Izannah is on that monument, that family monument that Jane put up. And that's the end of the story about Izannah and Jane and Aunt Jane and their life as doll makers. Hopefully that'll one day be a more complete story, but for now, those are the tidbits that we have. Before I leave you all, I would just like to mention the photo that I used for the graphic for this presentation, the Hold On Tightly to Your Dreams photo. This is a photograph of a little girl named Sarah Alice Langworthy, and I made this little pouch to hold it, but this is the original. And in this image, Sarah Alice was 22 months old. Now, this was taken after Izannah Walker received her patent. But this is a pre-patent doll that Sarah Alice is holding. And I'm going to tell you just a little bit more about that. This photograph, which is a card to visit, was taken December of 1884. Sarah was born in February of 1883 in Westerly, Rhode Island, which is 10 years after Izannah Walker received her patent. So that was a ways. Sarah Alice, unfortunately, did die in January of 1887, so she didn't live too much longer after this photograph was taken. So while I love this photo, it is very sad. I always think of her, and sorry, it does make me a little teary. Anyway, the information on the back has got her name and it's got her age, and I was able to take that information and do a little bit of genealogical research on her, which is how I found out that she died. She is holding this doll, but it's hard to know. I've had several theories that people have shared with me, and one, this could be a family doll that they brought along and gave to Sarah Alice to hold while she was having her photograph taken, to keep her busy for the longer exposure times. And because this is a pre-patent doll, it could conceivably have been the right age to be her mother's childhood doll, because they were from that area where Izannah lived and was working and making dolls. Or I had a photographer that also collects early photographs suggest to me that perhaps the doll was a prop that belonged to the photographer, that photographers would keep a box of toys to give children to play with while they took their photos, and keep them interested and amused, and they were something pretty that could be in the photo, but that would help the children hold still while they were waiting for the photograph to be taken. So that's Sarah Alice. I have just a little tiny bit more about her. When I bought this, I bought it from someone that was parting out a family album. So I do have a couple of more images. I have, let's see, where did I put those? Okay, so this is an image of Sarah Alice at 8 months old. And she was a sweet baby. And this is her younger brother. So all of those images I keep together, and I really treasure them. I think they're wonderful. So that is a little, just the whole story of Sarah Alice, and the photograph that I used both for today's presentation, but it was also the photograph that I used for the Izannah Walker exhibit that I curated for the Jenny Lynn Doll Show back in October of 2017. So if you didn't get to come see the exhibit in 2017, I hope that getting to watch and hear about these dolls today kind of made up for that. Most of these dolls were in the exhibit. This sweet girl that I just got recently wasn't, but the rest of them were, and Prudence was there, and she's here with us today. So I hope that that's, you know, been a treat for you if you were sad that you missed the exhibit. As far as hold on tightly to your dreams, I think that's important. To me, that means, for me, I've loved Izannah Walker dolls for a long time, so long that I can't even remember exactly how long it's been. I first saw photos of them in a magazine, like a country decorating magazine of some kind. The dolls were not identified. They were just as part of a room setting, and I fell in love. I loved those dolls, and I searched until I figured out who made them and found out a little bit more about them. And since then, I've sort of been chasing that dream. It took me a really long time to find even one to buy. It took me 10 years of trial and error to create patterns and figure out how to reproduce them myself. So for me, that's my dream. And I'm sure you guys all have your own doll collecting dreams and other dreams in your life. But if you hold on tightly to those dreams, I think that it helps you in everyday life. It's good to remember that you have something in your life to look forward to and something to strive for. And it's just one of those, you know, really great things. And I think that that's an important thing to remember right now while we're all having some difficult times and the world is a little strange. It's a good time to dream and to think about those dreams and to keep them close to your heart. So I hope you've enjoyed visiting with us today. Thank you. I know Rachel's got lots of really fantastic things planned for this week, and I was happy to invite you here to meet the dolls and sit in the parlor and chat. So thanks. Bye.